I signed the file. I need every representative in this tribunal chamber to understand that before I say anything else. Every name on the chain of approval, every authorization stamp, every digital confirmation that sealed humanity's fate, and very nearly sealed our own, all of it traces back to one signature at the bottom of one document, and that signature belongs to me. Rethik Solan, Senior Classification Analyst, Galactic Taxonomy Bureau, 42 cycles of service. I was the one who looked at everything the survey drones brought back from that noisy little world at the edge of the Orion Arm, and decided, with full professional confidence, that the species living on it was harmless. I rated them Tier 9. For those in this chamber unfamiliar with the classification system, and I suspect very few of you are unfamiliar anymore given the circumstances that brought us here, Tier 9 is the lowest threat designation the Bureau can assign to a spacefaring civilization. One step above decorative fungi, one step above organisms that pose no strategic, military, economic, or intellectual challenge to any established galactic power. When a senior analyst signs a Tier 9 classification, that analyst is telling every government, every conglomerate, every military strategist, and every economic planner in the galaxy that this species does not matter, that their resources are available, that their territory is open, that you can walk into their system, take what you want, reorganize their economy, and leave without consequence, because they lack the capability to respond in any meaningful way. I want this tribunal to understand that the data supported my conclusion at the time. Every model I ran, every biological metric the drones recorded, every scan our instruments could produce, pointed to the same answer. Humanity looked like nothing. They looked like a species that the galaxy would absorb and forget within a generation, the same way it had absorbed and forgotten 1,100 species before them. The system was designed for exactly this kind of assessment, and I was its most experienced operator. The survey drone flagged their system because of noise. Electromagnetic radiation, completely unencrypted, pouring out of the third planet like a burst pipe flooding a corridor. They were broadcasting everything they had into open space: entertainment signals, military communications, personal messages between individuals, scientific data, navigational telemetry, all of it sprayed into the void with no shielding, no encoding, no apparent awareness or concern that anyone might be listening. My colleague Mivan pulled the initial intercepts and spent 3 full rotations laughing at what she found. They were sending images of their food to each other, millions upon millions of images, every single day, of meals they were about to consume. She could not stop talking about it. She printed one of the images and pinned it to the wall of our shared workspace as a joke. It showed a flat circle of baked grain covered in melted dairy product and cured meat. I did not understand the appeal, but then again, understanding alien cuisine was not part of my professional responsibilities. I was focused on the biology report, and the biology report was damning. Their epidermis was soft, with almost no structural resistance to penetration or impact. Their skeletal framework was constructed of calcium compounds that fractured under moderate stress, requiring weeks of inactivity to repair naturally. Cellular regeneration was painfully slow by galactic standards. They possessed no venom glands, no natural armor plating of any kind, no electromagnetic sensitivity, no echolocation, no redundant cardiovascular or neurological systems. Their primary respiratory process depended on a gas that actively corroded most metals. They breathed poison, and it was the only thing keeping them alive. Their planet was worse. I have studied thousands of worlds in my career, and Earth ranks among the most aggressively hostile habitable planets I have ever encountered. Extreme axial tilt produced violent seasonal shifts across the entire surface, swinging temperatures by dozens of degrees within a single orbital period. Tectonic instability meant the ground itself periodically liquefied, collapsed, or split open, destroying whatever the inhabitants had built on top of it. Massive atmospheric disturbances generated winds capable of leveling entire settlement areas. The oceans, which covered over 70% of the surface, produced wave systems and thermal events that could devastate coastal regions without warning. A magnetosphere that barely kept the atmosphere from being stripped away by stellar radiation completed the picture of a world that seemed, by every reasonable interpretation, to be actively attempting to exterminate its own inhabitants. The fact that humans had survived at all was a minor statistical curiosity. The fact that they had developed tool use, language, agriculture, industry, and rudimentary spaceflight on such a world was mildly impressive in the way that a particularly clever laboratory specimen might impress a researcher. Noteworthy, but not significant, not threatening. Their technology confirmed every conclusion the biology had suggested. Chemical propulsion rockets. They were still strapping themselves to cylinders of burning fuel and hoping the explosion pushed them in the right direction with sufficient force to escape their own gravity well. Their fastest vessels could not have crossed their own system in less than several of their planetary years. They had no faster-than-light capability, no gravity manipulation, no energy shielding, no particle weapons, no computational systems capable of real-time strategic modeling. Their most advanced destructive technology consisted of fission and fusion devices, which they had apparently used on each other during a conflict, and then spent the following generations arguing about whether to ever use them again. They had no unified planetary government. Their political landscape was a fractured patchwork of competing nation-states that routinely could not agree on atmospheric temperature measurements, let alone coordinate a species-wide response to external contact. Mivan said classifying them felt like filing paperwork for a species of ambitious insects. I did not laugh at the time. I was too focused on the data, but I did not disagree with her assessment either. Everything we were looking at pointed in the same direction. Everything. Except one anomaly. There was one flag in the data that my models raised, and that I manually overrode, and I will carry the weight of that override for every remaining cycle of my life. It was buried in the endurance metrics, a subsection of the biological profile that most analysts skim past, because it rarely produces actionable intelligence. Humans were not strong by any meaningful galactic standard. They were not fast in any burst speed capacity. Their reflexes were adequate but unexceptional. However, their sustained performance numbers were strange. They could regulate their internal temperature through fluid excretion from pores across their entire skin surface. This meant they could maintain physical output in thermal conditions that would incapacitate or kill most galactic species within minutes. Their skeletal joints were designed for repetitive long-duration motion rather than explosive power, which meant they could sustain moderate physical activity for periods that my models initially flagged as data corruption because the numbers seemed impossibly long. They could walk, they could run, they could carry loads. They could do these things for hours and hours without stopping, and when they finally did stop, they recovered and did it again the next day. And then, there was the neural anomaly. Their brain chemistry under threat conditions showed a pattern I had never encountered in any species database. Most prey organisms, when confronted with a predator or a lethal environmental condition, display one of two responses. They freeze in place, hoping to avoid detection, or they flee, maximizing distance from the threat as rapidly as possible. These are universal patterns confirmed across thousands of documented biologies throughout the galaxy. Humans displayed both of these responses in some individuals, as expected. But a statistically significant percentage of their population displayed a third response that my classification models had no category for. When faced with lethal threat, these individuals accelerated toward the danger, not away from it, toward it. Their stress hormones spiked to levels that would indicate critical system failure in most species, but appeared to enhance human function. Their pain reception diminished. Their cognitive focus narrowed to the threat itself, excluding all peripheral information. Their heart rate stabilized rather than climbing, and their fine motor control actually improved. And then they moved forward, directly into the thing that was trying to kill them. My models flagged this as a data error, a sensor malfunction, or a sampling bias in the survey drone's behavioral observation window. The pattern was too anomalous, too far outside established biological norms to be real. I reviewed the flag. I spent half a rotation considering whether to request a secondary survey drone deployment to verify the data, and then I decided against it. The biological fundamentals were too clear. No species with that skeletal fragility, that respiratory dependency, that lack of natural weaponry, could pose a meaningful threat to a galactic power, regardless of what their stress hormones did during a crisis. The anomaly was interesting but irrelevant. A footnote. A curiosity. I overrode the flag. I moved on. I completed the classification file. The file went to the Bureau's approval board. It was stamped and authorized in 11 standard minutes. No committee review. No secondary analysis. No one on the board requested additional data or questioned the Tier 9 designation in any way. I have since learned that the average processing time for a Tier 9 classification is 14 minutes, which means my file was approved faster than the statistical norm. The board did not care about humanity. They had no reason to care. They had processed 1,000 species that looked exactly the same on paper: small, fragile, noisy, confined to a single star system with no meaningful projection capability, and every single one of those species had followed the predicted trajectory. The file was approved. Humanity's system was formally opened for standard resource integration, and I felt, if I am honest with this tribunal, mildly sorry for them. A small, brief emotion. The kind of sympathy you might feel for an insect caught in a mechanism it cannot understand, watching it struggle against forces so far beyond its comprehension that the struggle itself becomes a kind of tragedy. That sympathy was the last time I was wrong about something small. Every mistake I made after that, every failure of imagination, every moment where I trusted the system instead of my own growing unease, those mistakes were the kind that cost civilizations. The first extraction ships arrived in the Sol system 92 standard rotations after I signed the classification file. 3 corporate conglomerates had divided the system's resources among themselves before humanity even knew the file existed. The Vorenthi mineral conglomerate claimed the asteroid belt and the subsurface mineral deposits of the inner rocky planets. The Drael Energy Consortium secured harvesting rights for the gas giants, primarily the hydrogen and helium reserves in the 2 massive worlds humans called Jupiter and Saturn. And the Tesori Biogroup obtained exclusive access to the 3rd planet's oceanic biomass for pharmaceutical research and development. None of these entities sent ambassadors. None of them notified the native population in advance. None of them requested permission, because under Tier 9 classification, permission was not a legal requirement. They sent extraction teams, automated survey platforms, orbital processing stations, and a light military escort consisting of 12 patrol corvettes, and they began operations as if the 8 billion sentient beings living on that blue-green world were a weather pattern to be monitored rather than a population to be consulted. I want to be precise about this. What happened in the Sol system was not unusual. It was not an aberration or a failure of the system. It was the system functioning exactly as designed. It had been done to 1,100 species before humanity, and in every documented case, the outcome followed an identical pattern. Initial confusion and alarm from the native population, scattered attempts at communication, a brief period of social instability, sometimes including minor military gestures that the escort ships handled with minimal expenditure of resources. Then, inevitably, acceptance, resignation, a quiet, gradual absorption into the galactic economic framework as a labor pool and consumer base. The entire process typically completed within 20 standard cycles, from first contact to full integration. Humanity did not follow the pattern. They did not panic. I want this tribunal to understand how profoundly unusual that was. 8 billion individuals who had spent their entire existence believing they were alone in the universe suddenly found alien vessels in their orbital space, and alien machinery being assembled on their moons, and they did not collapse into species-wide chaos. There were disruptions, yes, localized conflicts. Some of their religious institutions experienced rapid theological upheaval. Several of their political structures realigned almost overnight. But as a species, as a collective organism, they stabilized faster than any Tier 9 population in the Bureau's entire historical record. Within 10 planetary rotations, their major national governments had established communication protocols with each other, specifically designed to address the alien presence. Not to fight it, because they understood immediately that fighting was not an option, to study it, to understand it, to map its structure and identify its vulnerabilities. Not military vulnerabilities, but procedural ones, legal ones, bureaucratic ones. Within 20 rotations, they had formed a coordinating body that functioned, for all practical purposes, as a unified planetary government, something they had failed to achieve in 10,000 years of trying. The alien presence did not paralyze them. It organized them. It gave them something they had apparently lacked for their entire history as a species: a reason to agree with each other. But what they did in those first 40 rotations should have triggered every alarm in the Galactic Intelligence Network, and the fact that it triggered none is a systemic failure that I believe this tribunal has a responsibility to investigate. Within 40 planetary rotations, human technical teams had reverse-engineered the communication protocols of every alien vessel operating in their system. Not the weapon systems, not the propulsion drives, not the shielding technology or the power generation systems, the communications. They cracked encryption that was rated unbreakable by species below Tier 4 capability. They did it using mathematical approaches that our own cryptographic engineers later described as unconventional, non-linear, and devastatingly effective. They did it with brains made of carbon and water and electrochemical impulses, using nothing but pattern recognition, collaborative analysis, and relentless, inexhaustible practice. And then they started talking to everyone. Every alien crew member who would respond to a transmission, every automated system that would accept an input query, every data terminal on every station and platform that was not physically secured against external access. The humans talked and talked and talked. They learned languages at speeds that the Bureau's linguistic models categorized as impossible for a species without direct neural interface technology. They learned Vorenthi trade dialect in 3 rotations. They learned Tesori scientific notation in 5. They achieved functional fluency in the Drael Energy Consortium's internal operating language, a deliberately obscured jargon designed to prevent competitor espionage, in under 12 rotations. The questions they asked were what should have alarmed us, not their speed of learning, which could have been written off as a statistical outlier. The questions themselves. They were not the questions of a frightened population trying to understand a threat. They were precise, targeted, systematic in a way that suggested coordinated strategic intelligence gathering rather than panicked curiosity. They wanted to know how the galactic classification system worked, not what it was in general terms, but exactly how it functioned. Who had designed the tier structure? What mathematical models underpinned the threat assessment algorithms? What legal frameworks authorized the classification process? Where those frameworks were documented? Who maintained them? How amendments were proposed and ratified? What precedent existed for species reclassification? Whether any Tier 9 species had ever successfully challenged its designation? What the specific quantitative criteria were for each tier boundary? How the appeal process functioned, step by step, form by form? Who sat on the review boards? How board members were selected, vetted, and replaced? They were not protesting their classification. They were disassembling the machinery that produced it, component by component, understanding every gear and lever and pressure point, and they were doing it with a thoroughness that should have terrified every bureaucrat in the galactic system. It did not, because no one who mattered was paying attention. The field reports from the Sol system during that period were classified as routine integration friction, increased communication attempts from native population, noted and filed, requests for procedural documentation from native representatives, logged and denied per standard Tier 9 information access protocols. None of it was escalated. None of it was analyzed in context. The system was designed to handle species like this, and the system's operators trusted it the way you trust a machine that has never failed. Then came the meeting on Titan Station. The Vorenthi mineral conglomerate had established a regional operations center on the largest moon of the planet humans called Saturn. A human delegation of 7 individuals, none of them holding any official position recognized by galactic law, requested a formal meeting with the regional director. His name was Kral Desivon. He had managed extraction operations across 30 star systems over a career spanning 60 cycles. He had dealt with native populations on dozens of worlds. He had never, in all that time, been surprised by anything a Tier 9 species had done. He agreed to the meeting because it amused him. He told his staff it would be entertaining to see what the small pink mammals wanted. He did not prepare. He did not review the intelligence summaries on human capability because there were no intelligence summaries worth reviewing. He sat down at the conference table with 3 of his senior managers, all of them relaxed, all of them expecting something between a curiosity and a comedy. The 7 humans arrived on a transport shuttle they had somehow acquired access to. They were unarmed, they wore simple clothing, the kind of functional garments that workers across many species might wear. They carried nothing that the security scanners identified as threatening or even noteworthy. They sat down across from Kral Desivan and his team, and without any preliminary conversation, they presented a document. The document was 90 pages long. It was written in formal Vorenthi legal script, a writing system so complex in its grammatical structure, its hierarchical honorific framework, and its contextual semantic layering, that most non-Vorenthi diplomatic corps required dedicated artificial intelligence translation systems to produce even basic correspondence in it. The humans had written 90 pages of flawless Vorenthi legal prose, and they had done it by hand. Not a single grammatical error, not a single misused honorific or incorrectly nested subordinate clause. The formatting followed Vorenthi legal conventions with such precision that Kral Desivan later admitted he initially assumed the document had been prepared by a Vorenthi defector working on behalf of the humans. It had not. A human team of 4 linguists and 2 legal researchers had produced it in 28 days, working from intercepted Vorenthi legal databases that they had accessed through communication channels they were not supposed to be able to crack. The document outlined 18 specific violations of the Galactic Commerce Charter that the Vorenthi mineral conglomerate was committing in the Sol system. Extraction without environmental impact assessment, resource removal exceeding sustainable yield calculations, failure to establish native population consultation frameworks, unauthorized structural modification of celestial bodies, discharge of processing byproducts into inhabited atmospheric systems. The list continued for 90 meticulously referenced pages, each violation cited with the relevant charter section, subsection, amendment number, and date of ratification. Kral Desivan read the first 3 pages carefully. Then he set the document down and laughed, not cruelly, but with genuine amusement. He explained to the human delegation, with the patient tone of an adult addressing confused children, that the Galactic Commerce Charter did not apply to Tier 9 species. Their classification formally exempted them from every protection and every provision that the Charter offered to recognized civilizations. The document, however impressive its formatting and however surprising its linguistic achievement, was legally meaningless. It had no standing. It could not be filed. It would not be reviewed. The lead human delegate, a woman named Clara Whitfield, nodded. She did not argue. She did not express frustration or anger. She said, very calmly, that they were aware of that. Then she paused for exactly long enough to ensure that everyone at the table was paying attention, and she added, in perfect formal Vorenthi register, we simply wanted to confirm that you know it too, that this is a deliberate choice you are making, and that you understand the nature of what you are choosing. Kral Desivan stopped smiling, not because the words were threatening. They were not. There was no threat in Clara Whitfield's tone, no aggression in her posture, nothing that a security officer would flag as hostile. He stopped smiling because something in the way she said it, something in the precision of her language and the steadiness of her gaze, made him feel, for the first time in his career, like the native species across the table knew something he did not. He reported the meeting in his quarterly operations summary, page 47 of a 60-page document. A minor curiosity, he recommended no changes to current operations. No one in the conglomerate's leadership structure read page 47. No one flagged the report for further analysis. No one understood that Clara Whitfield and her team were not protesting. They were documenting. Every meeting requested and denied was logged. Every resource extraction event was recorded with dates, quantities, and responsible entities. Every communication sent and unanswered was archived with timestamps, content hashes, and recipient identification codes. Every dismissal, every condescending explanation, every refusal to engage was cataloged with the same precision that the 90-page legal document had demonstrated. The humans were building a case. Not for a court, because no court in the galactic system would hear a complaint from a Tier 9 species. They were building a record for a reckoning they could already see coming, a reckoning that no one else believed was possible, and they were building it with the patience of a species that had spent 10,000 years learning how to wait for exactly the right moment to act. The other conglomerates experienced identical interactions, Small, polite human delegations appearing at operational sites across the Sol system, asking measured questions, presenting carefully researched documentation, accepting every dismissal with calm acknowledgement and no visible distress. The Dryal Energy Consortium's operations director on Jupiter Station described the humans as annoyingly persistent, but fundamentally harmless. The Tesori Bio Group's lead researcher on the ocean harvesting platform called them endearing in their stubbornness, which I think says more about the Tesori's capacity for condescension than it does about the humans. The Tesori interaction was, in retrospect, particularly revealing. The humans sent a marine biologist named Simon Price to the ocean harvesting platform, a massive floating facility that was systematically extracting deep-sea organisms from Earth's oceans for pharmaceutical synthesis. Price was polite. He was curious. He asked to observe the extraction process. The Tesori, amused by his interest, allowed him to watch. He spent 12 rotations on that platform, asking questions about extraction methodologies, yield rates, bioactive compound isolation techniques, and ecosystem impact assessments. He took notes constantly. He never complained. He never protested. He thanked the Tesori researchers for their time every single day. What the Tesori did not realize until much later was that Simon Price was not just learning about their process. He was cataloging every species they extracted, every population density measurement their scanners recorded, and every ecological disruption their harvesting caused. And he was transmitting that data nightly to the human coordinating body through a communication channel the Tesori's monitoring systems were not configured to detect. When the invoice arrived years later, the section on oceanic biomass extraction was so detailed that the Tesori Bio Group's own records could not match its precision. The humans knew more about what had been taken from their oceans than the species that had taken it. I first felt genuine unease, approximately 4 cycles into the integration period. A colleague in Galactic Intelligence forwarded me a brief, almost as an afterthought, about unusual trade activity detected in the Sol system's outer regions. Humans had established contact with the Drenahai. The Drenahai were a mid-tier species, Tier 5, who occupied 3 systems near the Orion Transit Corridor. They were not militarily powerful. They were not diplomatically influential, but they carried a long and well-documented resentment of the conglomerate system, having themselves been subjected to aggressive resource integration early in their spacefaring history, before they developed sufficient capability to force a reclassification. The humans were trading with them, not resources. Humanity had nothing the Drenahai needed in material terms. They were exchanging information. The intelligence brief noted that the Drenahai appeared to be providing humans with technical schematics, primarily propulsion designs, and energy generation frameworks, several generations beyond anything humanity had developed independently. What the humans were providing in return remained unclear. The brief flagged the activity as an economic anomaly, but assessed it as not a security concern. I read that brief 3 times. Then I filed a formal reclassification request with the Bureau. I cited the anomalous communication capabilities, the Vorenthi legal document, the systematic intelligence gathering behavior, and the Drenahai trade relationship. I argued that humanity's adaptive velocity exceeded every Tier 9 projection model in our database, and that the classification should be elevated to at least Tier 6, pending comprehensive investigation. My request was reviewed by a 3-member panel. It was denied in 6 standard rotations. The panel acknowledged the data points I had raised, but assessed them as consistent with aspiration phase behavior commonly observed in advanced Tier 9 populations. They recommended continued monitoring under standard observation protocols and suggested, with what I interpreted as professional condescension, that my concern might be influenced by the novelty of encountering a particularly communicative native species. The file stayed Tier 9, and the clock kept ticking. For 12 standard cycles after the Drenahai trade activity was first documented, humanity went quiet, not silent. They maintained all existing surface-level interactions. Small delegations continued visiting conglomerate sites. Cultural exchange programs continued operating within their restricted parameters. Diplomatic correspondence continued flowing through approved channels. To every monitoring system and every intelligence analyst observing the Sol system, humanity looked exactly like a Tier 9 species in the final stages of acceptance. The denial phase was over. The bargaining phase had passed. Resignation was settling in, followed inevitably by assimilation. The pattern had held for 1100 species. There was no reason to believe it would not hold for the 1101st. Every intelligence summary from the Sol system during those 12 cycles used identical language: stable, compliant, progressing within expected parameters. The conglomerates reduced their military escort presence because the cost was not justified by the non-existent threat level. 2 of the 12 patrol corvettes were redeployed to other systems, then 4 more. Within 8 cycles, the military presence in the Sol system had been reduced to 6 corvettes, the minimum required by corporate insurance regulations. I did not believe the summaries. The unease I had felt when I read about the Drenahai trade had not faded. It had grown. It sat in the back of my consciousness like a low-frequency vibration, constant and impossible to suppress. A feeling that something fundamental was happening, just beyond the range of my perception. I began monitoring human activity during my personal off-duty hours, using my analyst credentials to access survey satellite feeds, long-range sensor archives, and communication intercept logs from the Sol system's periphery. For the first 2 cycles of this private investigation, I found nothing that contradicted the official assessments. Human activity on their homeworld continued at its characteristically chaotic pace. Their lunar installations had expanded modestly. Their orbital infrastructure had grown within the boundaries of what limited technology transfers through official channels would support. Everything looked normal. Then I widened my search parameters to include the outer system, the regions beyond the gas giants where no conglomerate had operational interests and no intelligence platform was assigned, and everything I thought I knew about humanity collapsed. The first anomaly was a cluster of faint energy signatures in the Oort cloud, the vast shell of icy bodies that surrounded the Sol system at extreme distance from the central star. The Oort cloud was not monitored by any galactic system. It was not monitored because there was no reason to monitor it. It was a frozen wasteland at the very edge of interstellar space, too far from the star to support any economically viable activity, too diffuse to contain anything of strategic value, too vast and too empty to justify the sensor coverage that monitoring it would require. The energy signatures were faint and intermittent, consistent with small-scale industrial activity, the kind of power output you would expect from a minor fabrication facility producing components for local use. Nothing that would register as significant on any military threat assessment model. But there were dozens of them, scattered across the Oort cloud's inner shell in a distribution pattern that was too regular to be natural astronomical phenomena and too deliberately dispersed to be coincidental. Someone was building something out there, in the permanent dark, where no one had any reason to look. I redirected a survey satellite, one of the older models that had been relegated to long-range astronomical observation and was therefore not subject to operational scheduling oversight, and pointed it at the nearest energy signature. The resolution was not military grade, but it was sufficient to identify what I was seeing. A mining and fabrication facility, compact, efficient, designed for operation in the extreme cold and near-total darkness of the outer system. The extraction equipment matched Drenahai manufacturing patterns, but the structural framework was unmistakably human, displaying the modular, redundancy-heavy construction methodology that characterized their engineering philosophy. They had taken Drenahai technology and adapted it to work within their own design principles, and the resulting hybrid was something that neither species had produced independently. I spent 3 additional cycles systematically mapping every anomalous energy signature I could detect across the Sol system's outer regions. The Oort cloud facilities were just the visible edge of something much larger. There were construction sites hidden in the deep asteroid belt, positioned in the gravitational shadows of the largest bodies where sensor returns were naturally scattered and confused. There were installations on the permanently dark hemispheres of outer planetary moons, surfaces that faced away from the inner system and were naturally shielded from every observation platform the conglomerates had deployed. There were mobile construction platforms, slow-moving vessels that kept their energy output at levels so low that automated sensor systems classified them as background cosmic noise and filtered them out of the data stream before any analyst ever saw them. The scale was staggering. Humanity did not have the industrial capacity to build at this level. Not even with Drenahai assistance. The Drenahai could not have supplied enough material, enough expertise, enough manufacturing support to sustain this many simultaneous projects across this much volume of space. Which meant the Drenahai were not the only ones helping, and the scope of humanity's alliance network was far larger than my initial analysis had suggested. I began cross-referencing communication intercepts from the Sol system with known trade routes and transit patterns of minor galactic species, not the major powers, the small ones. Species rated between Tier 5 and Tier 8, civilizations too insignificant to attract dedicated intelligence monitoring, but technologically capable enough to possess useful knowledge and manufacturing capacity. The picture that assembled itself from the data made my circulatory system constrict in a way I had not experienced since my first military deployment. 14 species. Humans had established active exchange agreements with 14 different civilizations. The Drenahai and their propulsion technology. The Cathari, manufacturers of the most efficient energy shielding systems in the mid-rim sectors. The Pelori, whose biological computing architectures were considered eccentric by mainstream galactic science, but possessed processing capabilities that conventional systems could not replicate. The Sin Collective, whose materials science innovations included metamaterials that could redirect sensor returns. The Vreth, the Ulu, the Tanari, and 7 others whose names I had to search for in the Bureau's database because I had never encountered them in any file of operational significance. Every single one of them was minor. Every single one of them had experienced some form of disadvantage under the existing galactic economic system, and every single one of them had been quietly providing humanity with technology, training, raw materials, and specialized expertise for years. What the humans gave in return took me much longer to understand. They had no technology worth trading. They had no resources the other species needed. They had no military capability to offer as protection. What they gave was something far stranger and, as it turned out, far more valuable. They gave solutions. Answers to problems that alien civilizations had been struggling with for generations. The humans looked at engineering challenges, mathematical paradoxes, organizational inefficiencies, and design limitations that had constrained other species for centuries, and they solved them. Not because they were more intelligent. I want to be clear about that. Their raw cognitive capacity was well within normal galactic ranges. They solved them because they thought differently. They combined methodologies from unrelated fields. They drew analogies between systems that no other species would have connected. They made lateral leaps of intuition that bypassed conventional analytical pathways entirely. A Cathari diplomat told me, months later, that a team of human engineers solved a reactor containment instability problem that had limited Cathari ship design for over 200 cycles. The humans solved it in 11 rotations. The solution applied a mathematical principle drawn from human music theory, specifically, the harmonic resonance patterns in a form of structured sound they called a fugue, to the energy wave dynamics inside the containment field. The Cathari engineer who reviewed the solution said it was either the work of genius or insanity, and he was not confident the distinction was meaningful. The Drenahai received something equally unexpected. Their propulsion systems had always suffered from a thermal regulation problem at sustained high output, a flaw that limited their operational range and prevented their engines from reaching theoretical maximum efficiency. Human thermal engineers, drawing on their species' deep experience with managing heat in hostile environments, their own planet had been trying to cook or freeze them for their entire evolutionary history, redesigned the cooling architecture, using principles borrowed from the circulatory systems of Earth's largest ocean mammals. The redesigned drives ran 30% cooler and 12% more efficiently than anything the Drenahai had fielded in 3 centuries of independent development. For the Pelori, who communicated through biological computing networks that processed information through living neural tissue, the humans provided a mathematical compression framework that reduced data transmission errors by an order of magnitude. The framework was based on error correction algorithms originally developed for human digital communication networks, adapted to work with organic signal pathways. A Pelori network architect told me the humans had essentially translated silicon thinking into biological thinking, and that the translation lost nothing in the process. Each trade followed the same pattern. The humans received technology they needed. Their partners received solutions they had given up hoping for. And every exchange deepened the web of mutual dependence, and shared investment that bound the alliance together. By the time I discovered it, the network was not something that could be dismantled by removing any single participant. It was self-reinforcing. Every species in it needed the others, and every species knew it. I had gathered enough data. I assembled everything into an emergency reclassification package. Energy signatures, construction scale estimates, multi-species trade network analysis, technological capability projections, and a formal recommendation that humanity be reclassified to no lower than Tier 3, which would trigger mandatory military monitoring and diplomatic engagement protocols. I flagged the submission as critical priority and transmitted it directly to the Bureau's senior review board, bypassing my immediate supervisors because I no longer trusted the standard communication chain to treat this with the urgency it demanded. The review board took 3 full cycles to process my submission, 3 cycles during which humanity continued building, continued trading, continued preparing for something that I could feel approaching like a pressure change, before a storm but could not yet define. The board's ruling arrived in a formal document that I have since memorized, not by choice, but because its words have repeated themselves in my mind every day since I read them. The board acknowledged the anomalous construction activity. They acknowledged the multi-species trade network. They acknowledged that humanity's development trajectory exceeded standard Tier 9 projections by a significant margin. And then they concluded that all documented activity was consistent with typical Tier 9 developmental aspiration, a classification phrase that translated to a primitive species is building things it does not have the institutional sophistication to use effectively, and it does not warrant elevated concern. I requested a direct audience with the board chair. His name was Decivon Pralal, a Vorenthi who had held the position for 30 cycles and had never, in his entire tenure, elevated a Tier 9 species above Tier 7, because in his experience, no Tier 9 species had ever demonstrated the capacity to warrant it. I asked him whether anyone on the board had examined the shipyard images I had included in my submission. He told me, with the condescending patience of someone explaining basic arithmetic to a struggling student, that species at humanity's development level frequently engage in what he called performative military posturing, construction that exceeded their actual operational capability and served primarily as a psychological coping mechanism for their subordinate status. He said it was a documented pattern. He said I should not mistake ambition for competence. The file stayed Tier 9. I walked back to my office and sat in the dark for a very long time, listening to the hum of the station's life support systems and trying to calculate how much time I had wasted believing the system would correct itself. I arranged an unauthorized trip to the Sol system. I fabricated credentials identifying me as a commercial auditor for the Vorenthi mineral conglomerate, a cover that would grant me system access without triggering military security reviews. I booked passage on a supply freighter and spent 14 rotations in transit, reviewing data and preparing myself for what I expected to find. I was not prepared for what I actually found. The freighter dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the system's standard entry point. I had arranged a routing deviation to bring us near a rogue planetoid in the outer asteroid belt, citing a fictitious inspection requirement. As we approached, I used the freighter's commercial-grade sensors to scan the surrounding volume of space. The shipyard was built into the planetoid's shadow, positioned with mathematical precision so that the rock itself blocked direct line of sight from every standard approach vector and every known sensor platform in the system. The scale was larger than my satellite images had suggested, much larger. The main construction framework incorporated Drenahai structural methodology, but the power systems were Cathari, and the sensor deflection shielding that concealed the entire facility used SYN collective metamaterials arranged in configurations that bent detection returns around the structure like light bending around a gravitational lens. The workers were human, thousands of them, organized in rotating shifts, operating fabrication equipment from half a dozen different species with a practiced fluency that could only come from years of training and experience. They wore no uniforms, they carried no weapons, they moved through the facility with the focused efficiency of people who understood exactly what they were doing and exactly why it mattered. They were building warships, not warships like anything in the Galactic Military Registry, hybrid vessels that combined human structural engineering with Drenahai propulsion, Cathari shielding, and weapons systems I could not identify from any known technological tradition. The power plants driving these vessels used principles that did not match any species' published science, which meant the humans had not just borrowed technology, they had developed something new from the intersection of everything they had been given. But the warships were not what stopped my breath. Adjacent to the military construction bay, separated by a kilometer of vacuum and connected by a dedicated transit corridor, there was another facility, and in that facility, they were building colony ships, enormous vessels designed for sustained habitation of thousands of individuals, life support modules, agricultural systems, manufacturing bays, medical centers, educational facilities. These were not transports. They were self-sustaining mobile civilizations, designed to carry populations across interstellar distances and establish permanent settlements on arrival. This was not a rebellion. This was not a desperate strike by an oppressed species hoping to win a single battle and force better terms. This was a species preparing for permanent galactic expansion, and they had been preparing for years, quietly and methodically, while every authority that should have been watching was telling itself there was nothing to see. I stayed near the planetoid for as long as I could justify, without arousing suspicion from the freighter crew. In those final hours of observation, I noticed details that made the picture even more unsettling. The shipyard had its own communications array, but it was not broadcasting, it was receiving data streams from multiple points across the Sol system, and, I realized with a chill that went through me like cold metal, from outside the system entirely. The humans were receiving real-time information from their partner species across the galaxy, coordinating construction schedules, exchanging technical specifications, solving integration problems collaboratively across interstellar distances. They had built a communication network that operated below the detection threshold of every intelligence service in the galaxy, and they had been using it for years. I also noticed that the colony ships were not empty shells awaiting future completion. Several of them were already being outfitted with living systems. Hydroponic gardens were growing inside pressurized modules. Water recycling systems were running in test cycles. Medical equipment from at least 3 different species manufacturing traditions was being installed in clinical modules that had been designed to treat patients from multiple biologies. These ships were not aspirational concepts. They were being prepared for deployment. The humans and their allies intended to use them, and soon. The freighter departed the outer belt on schedule. I spent the return journey in my cabin, staring at the data I had collected on a secured tablet, running calculations I already knew the answers to, and feeling the weight of certainty settle onto me like atmosphere pressing down on a planetary surface. I left the Sol system on the next available transport, and did not file another reclassification request. I knew it would be denied. Instead, I encrypted everything I had observed and stored it in a personal archive with instructions for release to appropriate authorities in the event of a security crisis originating from the Sol system. 3 rotations after my return, I found a message on my personal terminal, not my bureau workstation, which was monitored and secured according to standard protocols. My personal terminal. The one I used for private correspondence, routed through 3 separate encryption relays on a network that was, according to every technical specification, impossible to access from outside my species' communication infrastructure. The message had no sender identification, no routing metadata, no timestamp. It was written in my language, in formal academic register, with perfect grammar and cultural context that reflected intimate familiarity with my species' communication norms. It contained one line: "We appreciate that you tried." I stared at that message for a long time, and in the silence of my quarters, I understood with perfect, terrible clarity that the humans had been watching me the entire time I was watching them. They had been watching everyone, every analyst, every board member, every intelligence officer, every conglomerate director. They knew who had raised concerns and who had dismissed them. They knew who had tried to warn the galaxy and who had laughed at the warnings. They were keeping track, and when the time came, they would know exactly who deserved what. 47 rotations after that message arrived on my terminal, every government, conglomerate, administrative body, and military command structure in the known galaxy received a simultaneous transmission. There was no sequential broadcast delay, no cascading relay pattern. The transmission arrived everywhere at the same instant, on every frequency, in every documented language, from relay points distributed across galactic space that no sensor network had ever detected being installed. The transmission was 400 pages long. It was not a declaration of war. It was not a threat. It was not an ultimatum. It was an invoice. Every resource extracted from the Sol system over 12 standard cycles was itemized with devastating precision. Every ton of asteroid mineral ore, listed by composition and extraction date. Every cubic unit of gas giant hydrogen, cataloged by harvesting platform and processing batch. Every biological sample taken from Earth's oceans, documented by species, collection coordinates, and intended pharmaceutical application. Every atmospheric compound harvested from the inner planets. Each line item included the responsible entity, the extraction methodology, the market value at the time of removal, calculated according to Galactic Commerce Authority published indices, inflation adjustment using the Galactic Commerce Authority's own formulas, and compound interest at the standard rate specified in the Galactic Commerce Charter. The same charter that did not apply to Tier 9 species. The humans used it anyway. They took every rule, every standard, every legal framework that the galactic system had built for the benefit of recognized civilizations, and then deliberately exempted from applying to species it classified as beneath protection, and they held it up as a mirror. They showed the galaxy exactly what its own principles would demand, if those principles were applied consistently, without the convenient exclusions that made the system profitable. The total figure was a number I am not permitted to state in open tribunal proceedings. I will say only that it exceeded the combined gross economic output of multiple mid-tier civilizations. It was a sum so vast that paying it in currency would have required the restructuring of the entire galactic financial system. But the invoice did not request currency. The last page made that clear, and the last page was what ignited panic across 12 galactic sectors. Payment is not requested in monetary instruments. Compensation will be collected in territorial holdings. The following systems have been identified as appropriate remuneration for the documented debt. Evacuation timelines for current occupants are included as a courtesy. Failure to vacate within specified windows will be interpreted as acceptance of joint habitation under human administrative authority. The list contained 17 star systems. The Galactic Council convened emergency session within the hour. I observed from my office through a classified analytical feed. The council chamber, a hall designed for measured deliberation by an institution that had governed for millennia, had transformed into something close to a riot. Representatives were on their feet. Translators were overwhelmed. Security personnel lined the walls, unsure whether they were there to protect the delegates or contain them. Military commanders from 6 major species presented tactical assessments. Their confidence was absolute and uniform. Humanity possessed, by the most generous estimates, somewhere between 400 and 800 vessels of uncertain capability. The combined galactic fleet numbered over 14,000 dedicated warships, supported by logistics and supply infrastructure that had been developed and refined over centuries of military operations. The commanders argued that whatever hybrid technology the humans had assembled from minor species components would collapse under sustained fire from proper galactic weapon systems. They recommended immediate, overwhelming military response. The Heldrathi Supreme Commander, a towering career officer named Varric Soth who had personally commanded the suppression of 3 species-level military uprisings, delivered a 40-minute tactical briefing. He projected fleet deployments, engagement corridors, supply chain logistics, and casualty estimates. He walked the chamber through 3 operational scenarios, each one more aggressive than the last, and concluded that the human military capability could be neutralized within 6 standard rotations at acceptable cost under any of them. He said the word acceptable 7 times. I counted. What struck me, watching from my office, was what none of the military commanders addressed. Not one of them discussed the invoice itself. Not one of them questioned how humanity had obtained the data to compile it. Not one of them asked how a Tier 9 species had acquired the ability to simultaneously broadcast to every communication system in the galaxy without being detected. They treated the transmission as a provocation to be answered with force, not as evidence of capabilities that should have terrified them. They saw the challenge and missed the competence behind it, the same way the Bureau had missed it, the same way the conglomerates had missed it. the same way every institution in the galactic system had been missing it for 12 cycles. The vote was nearly unanimous. 11 of 13 council species voted to reject the invoice and authorize military response. The Pelori abstained. The Cathari voted against. And then the Cathari ambassador stood. Her name was Sivan Toll. She had occupied the Cathari council seat for 20 cycles. She had never attracted significant attention. She had never delivered a notable speech. She had never voted against the council majority on any matter of consequence. She was, by every assessment, a minor diplomat representing a mid-tier species that the major powers tolerated without respecting. She requested the floor. She was granted 3 minutes as a procedural courtesy. She used less than 1. The Cathari sovereignty formally recognizes the human invoice as a legitimate debt instrument consistent with the founding principles of the Galactic Commerce Charter. The sovereignty will not participate in, support, or facilitate any military action directed at the Sol system, human-affiliated territories, or human-allied species. Furthermore, the sovereignty extends full diplomatic recognition to the Human Coordinating Authority as a sovereign interstellar government. She sat down. The chamber was silent, not the silence of surprise, the deeper silence of a load-bearing wall, developing its first visible crack. Within the hour, 8 additional species issued declarations of alignment. The Drenahai, the Pelori, reversing their abstention, the Sin Collective, the Vreth, the Olu, the Tanari. 2 others I had to search the Bureau's database to identify. Minor species, every one. Civilizations that the Council had never considered important enough to court, to threaten, or to fear. Civilizations that had lived in the economic margins of the galactic system for generations, classified, categorized, and forgotten. Together, those 10 species represented nearly 30% of the galaxy's total industrial output. Not military power, manufacturing capacity, resource processing, component fabrication, logistics infrastructure, the industrial base that built the warships, produced the fuel, fabricated the ammunition, and maintained the supply chains that any large-scale military campaign depended upon absolutely. 30% of that base had just refused to participate in a war against humanity. And without that 30%, the strategic calculations that had produced the military commander's confident 6-rotation timeline were no longer valid. I watched the council chamber erupt. Major species representatives screamed accusations of treason. The Heldrothi delegation threatened economic blockade against every species that had sided with humanity. The Varenthi demanded immediate sanctions and asset seizure. A Tesori representative proposed revoking the Cathari's council membership entirely, a move that had no legal basis but received vocal support from at least 3 other delegations. Sivan Toll sat through all of it without expression, her hands folded calmly on the desk in front of her, and said nothing further. She did not need to. The declarations had been issued. The industrial leverage was real. No amount of shouting could change the mathematics. I noticed something else during the chaos. The minor species representatives who had not declared alignment, species that were too small or too cautious to commit publicly, were watching in silence. They were not participating in the outrage. They were not defending the council's position. They were observing, the same way the humans observed, with careful attention and very little expression. I wondered how many of them had been approached by human representatives, and how many of them were waiting to see what happened before making their own decisions. The alliance of 14 might have been just the visible portion of a much larger shift. In the observer gallery, in the small section reserved for species without formal council membership, a human woman sat, Nora Bishop. Her official registration described her title as public historian. She carried a tablet. She was writing everything down. When the Heldrothi representative slammed his fist against his desk hard enough to crack the surface, Nora Bishop glanced up briefly, noted the time on her tablet, and continued writing. She was not frightened. She was not impressed. She was doing her job. The military operation launched 9 rotations after the invoice was received. The 9-rotation gap was not strategic calculation. It was the time required for the 3 participating species to argue about fleet composition, command authority, and rules of engagement. Each species wanted its own commander leading the operation. Each species wanted its own ships in the vanguard. Each species wanted credit for the inevitable victory that all of them were certain was coming. In the end, they compromised on Varric Soth as supreme commander, with the Vorenthi and Tesori providing support wings under his tactical authority. 4,000 warships from 3 major species jumped toward the Sol system. It was the largest single-fleet deployment in over 200 cycles. I tracked the operation from my office. The fleet's transit was flawless. Formation integrity held. Arrival coordinates were precise. 4,000 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the Sol system's outer boundary. Weapons charged, shields at full power, sensor arrays sweeping the space ahead. The fleet stopped, not because it was attacked, not because it encountered mines or defense platforms, or any countermeasure the strategists had anticipated. It stopped because the commanders saw what was waiting for them. The transmission that returned from the fleet arrived 11 minutes after emergence. It was from Varric Soth himself, sent on an open channel. A single sentence. Reclassification requested. Immediately. What Varric Soth saw, he described in his own testimony to this tribunal, and I watched the most decorated military commander of his generation struggle to maintain professional composure as he recounted it. The human fleet was not 400 ships. It was not 800. It was over 6,000 vessels arrayed across the Sol system's outer boundary in formations that demonstrated sophisticated tactical doctrine, and those were only the ones that had activated their systems and allowed themselves to be detected. Varric Soth estimated the true number, including vessels remaining in concealment, at between 8 and 12,000. The ships were designs that existed in no galactic registry. Human structural engineering providing the skeleton, emphasizing the redundancy and damage tolerance that characterized their building philosophy. Cathari metamaterial shielding, making them functionally invisible to standard targeting systems until they chose to reveal themselves. Enhanced Drenahai propulsion, operating at energy outputs that exceeded original Drenahai specifications by multiples that suggested not incremental improvement, but fundamental redesign. Weapons systems integrated from at least 4 different species technologies, unified by control architectures that no single species had ever developed, architectures that could only have been produced by a civilization that understood all 4 traditions well enough to find the connections between them that the original builders had never seen. But the ships were not what shattered Varric Soth's confidence. He was a combat officer. He had faced superior numbers. He had fought unfamiliar technology. He had improvised and adapted, and won battles that the models predicted he would lose. Ships could be fought. What could not be fought was the infrastructure behind them. Gate stations, faster-than-light transit anchors, not in the Sol system, but distributed across the galaxy. Varric Soth's sensor arrays detected the network the moment his fleet arrived, and he understood instantly that the humans had allowed him to detect it. They wanted him to see. They wanted him to understand the full scope of what he was facing before he made any decisions he could not undo. The humans had been placing transit gates in interstellar space for years. Small ships, slow ships, vessels so tiny and so low-powered that they registered on military sensor networks as cosmic background noise and were automatically filtered out of the data stream. Each ship carried a gate component. Each traveled for months or years to reach its designated position in the vast empty spaces between star systems, in gravitational null points where no one traveled, in the deep void where even light took years to cross. And then, silently, in the permanent dark between the stars, they assembled a transit network that spanned the galaxy. The human fleet at the Sol boundary was not a defensive force. It was a rapid deployment strike capability that could project power to any point in the galaxy within hours. The fleet Varric Soth was staring at could be at the Heldrathi homeworld before his own ships could return there. It could reach the Vorenthi capital systems, the Tesori breeding colonies, the council station itself. It could be everywhere. The humans had not built a wall to hide behind. They had built a web, and the entire galaxy was already inside it. Varric Soth sent the reclassification request because fighting was not a rational option, not because he would have lost at Sol, although his revised tactical models indicated he would, because winning at Seoul would achieve nothing if the human fleet simply bypassed his position and struck every target he was supposed to be protecting. There was another detail from Varric Soth's testimony that I think the tribunal should know, though he mentioned it only briefly and seemed reluctant to elaborate. When his fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel and the human formation became visible on his tactical display, a communication channel opened. Not a demand, not a warning. A single human voice, speaking flawless Heldrathi military protocol dialect, which is a language that even most Heldrathi civilians do not speak, identifying themselves as the human fleet coordinator and offering to provide Varric Soth's medical officers with the specific radiation frequencies his crews would need to calibrate their shielding against during the return journey to Heldrathi space. The human had noticed that the Galactic Fleet's approach corridor had passed through a region of elevated stellar radiation that could cause cumulative exposure problems on the return trip. They were offering to help. Varric Soth told the tribunal that in 38 years of military command, across 11 campaigns and 4 confirmed engagements with hostile species, no enemy had ever opened communications by offering to protect his crew's health. He said it was the single most disorienting moment of his career. Not the 6,000 ships, not the gate network. A stranger offering his people medical data before a shot had been fired. I asked him, during a recess in the proceedings, whether he had accepted the information. He said he had. He said it was accurate. The negotiation did not take place in the council chamber, which had descended into procedural paralysis. It happened in a conference room on the 63rd level of the council station, a room normally reserved for minor trade arbitration. I was present, not because of my rank or my authority, both of which were negligible in this context. I was present because I was the only analyst in the Galactic Taxonomy Bureau who had predicted any element of what was happening, and the council now considered my perspective essential. They called it expertise. I understood it for what it actually was, the unique qualification of having been wrong first, and therefore having had the longest time to contemplate the architecture of the mistake. 6 representatives from the major species sat on one side of the table. 1 human sat on the other. His name was Peter Hale. He was older than the public historian in the gallery, with gray at his temples and deep lines around his eyes that tightened when he concentrated. He carried no weapon. He brought no staff. He placed a single tablet device on the table in front of him and waited, with a patience that seemed physically impossible for a species with such short lifespans, for the others to finish their preliminary statements. When the room fell silent, Peter Hale spoke for approximately 4 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not reference the fleet. He did not mention the gate network. He did not invoke the alliance or the industrial leverage that 30% of the Galaxy's manufacturing base provided. He simply laid out terms as if he were describing the weather. Humanity did not want war. Humanity had never wanted war. Every ship, every gate, every alliance had been built because the existing system provided no mechanism for a Tier 9 species to negotiate with the powers that controlled its fate, and the only way to gain access to the negotiating table was to become powerful enough that refusing to negotiate was more dangerous than engaging. The fleet was not a weapon of conquest. It was a credential. The invoice was real, the debt was real, and the payment humanity was requesting was territorial. 17 star systems. He activated his tablet and projected a galactic map with the 17 systems highlighted. The Heldrathi representative studied the map. His initial expression was combative, the posture of a military culture preparing to reject unreasonable demands. Then his posture changed. He leaned forward. He examined the system designations more carefully, and then he leaned back, with an expression I can only describe as bewildered. He asked Peter Hale whether there had been an error in the selection. The 17 systems on the list were dead zones, exhausted extraction sites, worlds that corporate conglomerates had mined until every valuable resource was depleted, then abandoned without remediation. Planets with collapsed ecosystems, irradiated surfaces, poisoned atmospheres, sterilized soils. Territory that was, by every economic valuation metric in the galactic system, worthless. Less than worthless, because the environmental damage made them liabilities rather than assets. Peter Hale confirmed there was no error. These were the systems humanity wanted. The Varenthi representative, visibly confused, asked why. Humanity's military position would have allowed them to demand prime territory. Resource-rich worlds, strategic locations, core systems. Why would they claim the galaxy's refuse? Peter Hale answered, and what he said has occupied my thoughts every single day since that meeting. Because we know how to fix them, and because every species that helped us is going to need somewhere to grow. The silence that followed lasted a very long time. The Tesori representative broke it first. She leaned forward and asked Peter Hale to clarify what he meant by fix them. These were worlds her own corporation had classified as permanently non-viable. The environmental damage was comprehensive. Irradiated soils, to collapsed hydrological systems, atmospheres contaminated with processing byproducts that would take centuries to dissipate naturally. Her own scientists had calculated the restoration costs and concluded that rebuilding these worlds from scratch would be cheaper than repairing them, and rebuilding from scratch was economically impossible by any existing model. Peter Hale nodded. He said he was aware of the Tesori assessments. He said his people had reviewed them carefully, and then he activated another display on his tablet and showed the room a projection that made every representative fall silent again. It was a restoration timeline, 17 systems, each with a detailed remediation plan, atmospheric processing schedules, soil decontamination protocols, water cycle reconstruction methodologies, ecosystem reseeding programs. Each plan drew on technologies from multiple alliance species, combined in configurations that no single civilization had ever attempted. The Cathari energy systems powering the atmospheric processors, Sin collective metamaterials, filtering contaminants from water tables, Pelori biological computing networks monitoring and adjusting ecosystem variables in real time, Tanari botanical science, providing the living organisms that would rebuild soil chemistry from the molecular level up, Drenahai engineering, constructing the physical infrastructure, and human organizational methodology holding all of it together, coordinating schedules across species that had never worked with each other, managing supply chains that spanned half the galaxy, translating between scientific traditions that used incompatible frameworks. The humans were not the most advanced species in the Alliance. They were not the smartest or the strongest, or the most technologically sophisticated. They were the ones who could make everyone else work together. The Heldrathi representative studied the timeline for a long time. Then he asked a question that I think surprised even him. He asked how long humans expected the restoration to take. Peter Hale said, depending on the system, between 15 and 40 cycles. He said the first worlds would be habitable within a generation. He said that some of them, the ones with the least severe damage, would be self-sustaining ecosystems within 2 generations, able to support permanent populations without continued technological intervention. He said this calmly, stating facts, not making promises, describing something that was already in motion, already planned, already staffed, already funded, by the combined industrial output of 15 species that had decided, together, that the galaxy could be better than what it was. The Vorenthi representative asked who would live on these restored worlds. Peter Hale said anyone who needed a home. Alliance species would have priority, but the worlds would be open to any species willing to participate in their maintenance and governance. The restored systems would not be human territory. They would be shared territory, governed by a cooperative framework that gave every participating species an equal voice. I watched the 6 representatives process what they had just heard. I watched them recalculate. I could see it happening behind their eyes, the collapse of one framework and the uncertain emergence of another. They had entered the room expecting to negotiate with a conqueror, a species that had built overwhelming military power, and intended to use it the way every powerful species in galactic history had used it, for dominance, for control, for the accumulation of resources and territory at the expense of others. What they found instead was a species that had built the most formidable military force the galaxy had ever seen, specifically so that it could negotiate the right to clean up after the galaxy's failures. The 14 species that had traded with humanity were not vassals or client states. They were partners. Genuine partners in a joint enterprise that was larger and more ambitious than anything the Galactic Council had ever attempted. The colony ships I had seen in the hidden shipyard were not for human expansion alone. They were cooperative ventures. Each dead system would be reclaimed and restored by multi-species teams, using the integrated technologies that the Alliance had developed through years of collaboration. Each restored world would be shared. Humanity had not built an empire. They had built a cooperative, and they had done it so quietly, so patiently, with such meticulous attention to the blind spots and assumptions of the system they were operating within, that the galaxy did not realize what had happened until it was already finished. The negotiations lasted 9 rotations. They were, by the standards of galactic diplomacy, remarkably straightforward, because Peter Hale and his team had prepared for every objection, every counterproposal, and every procedural delay before they entered the room. They had spent years studying how the galactic system negotiated. They knew its pressure points and its blind spots. They knew which representatives would object on principle and which would calculate costs. They had drafted alternative language for every disputed clause before the disputes arose. The terms were accepted. The 17 systems were formally transferred to human administrative authority. The galactic classification system was suspended pending comprehensive reform, with a transitional committee that included representatives from every tier level rather than only the major powers. The Commerce Charter was amended to extend its full protections to all spacefaring species, regardless of developmental classification. A new provision was added, requiring environmental remediation bonds before any resource extraction could commence in any system, ensuring that what had been done to the 17 dead worlds could never be done again without the responsible party bearing the full cost of restoration. The conglomerates filed legal objections. The Vorenthi Mineral Conglomerate argued that the charter amendments were retroactive and therefore invalid. The objection was overruled. The Drail Energy Consortium claimed that their harvesting rights in the Sol system constituted pre-existing contracts that could not be voided by treaty modification. The claim was denied. The Tesori Biogroup attempted to argue that the oceanic biomass they had extracted had been common heritage resources not subject to sovereignty claims. The tribunal rejected this on the grounds that the Tesori's own classification protocols had specifically identified the biomass as belonging to the native ecosystem of a populated world. Military commanders from the major species filed strategic threat assessments, warning that the human gate network represented an existential risk to galactic security. The assessments were received, noted, and archived without action, because every officer who filed one knew that acting on it would trigger the exact conflict the negotiations had been designed to prevent. I am standing before this tribunal now, answering the question I was formally asked at the beginning of these proceedings. In my professional opinion, as a senior classification analyst with 42 cycles of service, what threat tier should humanity be assigned? I have considered this question with great care. I have considered it through the negotiations, through the charter amendments, through my journey home, and through the months since, as reports have arrived from the 17 transferred systems. Reports of atmospheric processors being assembled on worlds that had been classified as permanently non-viable, of soil remediation projects combining human agricultural science with Cathari biological engineering and Pelori computational ecology, of water purification systems designed by Sin Collective Materials engineers working alongside human hydrologists who had never met a Sin before. The Alliance brought them together, of infrastructure rising on dead worlds, built by crews from 6 or 8 or 10 different species who, 3 cycles ago, had never collaborated on anything. The question is wrong. I say that with complete respect for this tribunal, and full awareness that criticizing the question is beyond the scope of my professional role. But the question is fundamentally wrong, because the threat tier system, every tier from 9 to 1, is calibrated against a single metric: the capacity for destruction. The entire framework rests on the assumption that a species' significance is determined by its ability to damage, to disrupt, to defeat, to destroy. Power, in the context of our classification system, means the ability to break things. Humanity's power was never that. They could have broken things. Their fleet, their gate network, their alliance structure, all of it gave them the capacity to wage a war of conquest that would have reshaped the galactic map within a single cycle. They chose not to. Not because they lacked the stomach for it, but because breaking things was never the objective. It was never what they were building toward. Their power was patience, organization. The ability to look at a system designed to keep them classified as insignificant, and rather than raging against it, to study it with absolute precision, map every assumption and every blind spot, and build something new in the spaces where no one was looking. They turned 14 forgotten species into a coalition that controlled 30% of galactic industry. They turned abandoned worlds into joint ventures. They turned an invoice into a restructuring of the galactic order. You do not assign a threat tier to a species that rewrites the classification system. That is my answer, and it is the only honest answer I am capable of giving. I have one final observation, and it falls outside my professional assessment. It is personal, and I ask the tribunal's indulgence. Six months after the negotiations concluded, I traveled to one of the 17 transferred systems, the fourth on the list, a mining system that the Tesori Biogroup had exhausted and abandoned 40 cycles ago. When they departed, the primary habitable world had an irradiated surface, a collapsed hydrological cycle, and soil contamination so severe that no biological organism could survive in it. The Tesori classified it as permanently non-viable and removed it from their corporate asset registry without remediation. When I arrived, the atmosphere processors were operational. Human-designed structural frameworks, Drenahai-manufactured components, Cathari energy systems supplying power, Pelori computational networks managing atmospheric composition in real time, adjusting gas ratios and particulate filtration on a minute-by-minute basis. The air was not yet clean by habitation standards, but it was improving measurably with every cycle. The water restoration program was underway, using a technique that a Sin collective materials scientist and a human environmental engineer had developed together during their transit to the system. They had never met before the alliance paired them. They had no common language when they started. Within 30 rotations, they had invented a filtration membrane that neither of their species' existing science could have produced independently. It processed irradiated subsurface ice into clean water at rates that exceeded the Tesori's original extraction capacity for the same resource. I walked through a small settlement near the primary processing facility. Temporary structures, mostly, prefabricated housing for the restoration crews, a medical station staffed by practitioners from 3 species, a communal dining facility where the menu changed daily based on which species' cuisine the rotating kitchen team felt like preparing, and at the edge of the settlement, an education center. I stopped at the education center and looked through the transparent walls. Inside, children from 6 different species sat together in a room that smelled like recycled air and fresh polymer, learning a shared curriculum, taught by instructors from 4 worlds who had never occupied the same classroom before this project brought them together. A Drenahai teacher was explaining atmospheric chemistry using a holographic model, while a human child and a Cathari child collaborated on a diagram that mixed notation systems from both their cultures. Beyond the settlement, at the edge of the restoration zone, I found a field. 2 cycles ago, this ground had been irradiated wasteland, soil so poisoned that even the hardiest extremophile organisms could not survive in it. Now it was dark, turned, treated earth, and growing in it, small and fragile and barely visible above the surface, were the first plants. Seedlings from a species native to the Tanari homeworld, selected because their root systems were uniquely suited to binding contaminated soil and gradually filtering toxins from the substrate. They were tiny, they were delicate. They would take years to mature. But they were alive, growing in ground that a galactic corporation had written off as dead forever. A human worker was checking moisture sensors along the perimeter of the field. She was young. She wore the same functional clothing I had seen on the shipyard workers years ago. She noticed me standing at the edge of the field, watching, and she walked over. She did not ask who I was or why I was there. She reached into her pack and offered me a container of water. I asked where it came from. She said the processing facility had purified it from subsurface ice deposits that the Tesori had never bothered to extract because ice had no commercial value in their economic models. I drank it. It was cold and clean, and it tasted the way rain tastes on a world where it has not rained in decades, like something returning that you had forgotten was missing. The human worker smiled at me, the easy smile of someone who was exactly where she wanted to be, doing exactly what she believed mattered, and she went back to her sensors. I stood in that field on that broken world that was slowly being made whole by the combined effort of species that the galaxy had dismissed as unimportant, and I thought about a file I had signed on a Tuesday, and I understood, finally and completely, that being wrong about humanity was the most important thing I had ever done, not because it taught me about them, because it taught me about us. About what we built when we decided that some species mattered and others did not. About what we lost when we stopped looking at the ones we had discarded. About what it costs to build a system that classifies the living as harmless, and then acts surprised when the harmless turn out to be the ones who remember everything. The galaxy held humanity as harmless. It paid for that mistake in planets. But the planets it lost were the ones it had already destroyed, and the species it underestimated was the one that came back to make them whole again. I have nothing further for the tribunal.